So good morning, myself is Abdul Muhammad. So I will be helping Shawn in his today's talk that measuring risk in 2020, which device will be your weakest link. Shawn, so Shawn background is he's a senior system engineer and customer evangelist at Forescout. Shawn is an accomplished and well-respected public speaker and system engineer. His strong mix of technical acumen, architectural experience, and sales savvy have established Shawn as a trusted advisor to each of his customers. His work with over almost 20-year career. His background includes cybersecurity, biometrics and identity management, IT operation, and service management and ITSS management. From here, I will turn it over to the speaker. Shawn, you can go ahead and start.
Thank you, Abdul. Good morning, Debbie, Eileen, Eric, Myron, and Tim. Hope it's okay that I call you Timothy. So appreciate the time this morning. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through an interesting report that that Forescout released not long ago regarding device risk, and the different types of risks and types of devices that ultimately exist on networks today. So without further ado, and by all means, Abdul will be here. We've got a chat window open. Please welcome the opportunity for questions. Anything that pops up, anything that comes top of mind, there's a specific slide or topic that I touch on, certainly would want to make sure and address it, right? So I think I want to lead off first and foremost, really, the enterprises today really have become what we've coined the enterprise of things. And when we really look at the enterprise, it is truly consisting of really kind of a myriad of factors, right? First and foremost is a very diverse landscape of devices that are connected. These graphics, these icons that are on there represent a sampling, but in your environments today, wherever you may work, we're talking about all different types of devices that are connected, that have an IP address, that are communicating across the wire. Things like scanners and barcode readers and IP cameras and HVAC sensors and VoIP phones and printers, and all of these other things that are connected either in a wired or wireless fashion, ultimately really driving to a significant footprint and a level of complexity that's previously been really unexperienced. Now you say, okay, well, let's look at the various manufacturers that sort of comprise that landscape, right? And this is a sampling, but we're familiar across the board working in sort of the cyberspace, working in IT. We're certainly aware of these. The ones that sort of pop in mind to me, Nest, right? I've got multiple Nest devices that are here in my house in Virginia with things. Lutron from a smart lighting perspective, those kinds of things. Wink, Blink, right? Ultimately, all of these different types of devices that are connected to the network, inclusive of ABB and others, right? That really sort of span the gamut of capabilities. And what we found is that these devices are very often solely purposed, right? There's a sensor, there's a chip, there's a storage, and there's a communication mechanism, there's a radio of some kind. But they are solely purposed. So there's very complex device landscape, right? So we've got this diversity, this massive scale, and ultimately many of these devices are owned by third parties, right? So these devices are connected to the network, but they are ultimately third party. And then the connectivity of the devices, increased site-to-site connectivity, 5G, that is something that I don't know very many organizations really have a handle on exactly how to go about managing that. And what does that really mean? What are the technical ramifications of implementation of 5G? Mesh, mesh is not necessarily a new concept, but it's something that I certainly embraced with COVID. I've got 3 daughters in high, middle, and elementary school who all are doing school right now in various rooms in the house behind me. So needed to deploy a mesh network to give greater connectivity, greater coverage throughout the house. And then behavior, right? Remote workforce. I just talked about it. Not sure how long this work from home thing is going to continue, but I certainly would have been there in previous years. I would have been with you guys down in Raleigh speaking in person. That's not happening anymore, at least not for the foreseeable future. Cloud adoption. Cloud is not a new construct, but ultimately driving more and more of deployments getting out of the physical form factor and getting up into a cloud-based deployment, right? And then doing more with less. That's sort of the quintessential, it's the age-old adage that we as practitioners need to ultimately do more with less, right? So there's a multitude of real factors that kind of go into this, which really sort of introduces this incredibly expanding risk surface that presents itself to us to try and protect, right? And some of these stories are older. Some of them aren't necessarily, are more recent, right? The fish tank being hacked, who would have thought that a fish tank was connected to the network in such a fashion that it could allow an adversary to hack that fish tank and gain access to the casino network. Smart displays. I have a customer in New York City, did an evaluation for, and during the on-site evaluation, we provided a capability, and we did a readout essentially of the findings, and told the CISO of this city agency in New York City, I said, "You've got 2 smart TVs connected to your network." And he was like, "No, we don't." I was like, "Yeah, you do, right here." And I pointed to them, pointed to the IP addresses, and we could see them on the network. So it was this large bullpen of cubicles overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge, and we stood up and we kind of looked at opposite ends of this bullpen of cubes. And sure enough, there were 2 smart TVs, right? They weren't on, they weren't there, but at the end of the day, I ultimately could see a little red LED light on each one of them, which meant the NIC card was live, which meant the IP address was consumed, right? So ultimately, the multitude of these. But one that really sort of jumps out at me is Ripple 20, and I have to believe that everybody on the call here, now we're up to 13 attendees, it's good to see everybody. Ripple 20, I assume everybody's heard about this. It was something that was released. It was detected, but ultimately the TCP/IP stack that is OEM'd and is embedded in a multitude of IoT devices really sort of presents an incredibly risky proposition for many people, right? First and foremost, you need to be able to identify those devices. You need to understand what's there. You need to understand how you can sort of protect yourself and protect the environment, the enterprise from those devices as they are incredibly vulnerable. So let me sort of fast forward a bit, right? So Forescout Research Labs, an organization that is comprised of engineers and data scientists globally, released a report earlier this year. It was it's entitled the Annual Enterprise of Things Report, right? The State of IoT Cybersecurity. And there's the session this morning is really to kind of go through some of those findings and give a sense of what we feel really should be things that are top of mind, right? And some of the questions that we're gonna pose, we're gonna discuss are, really what are the risks that those devices pose? How should you go about quantifying those risks? And then ultimately, what can be done about them, right? How can organizations address and manage those risks? But the quote of the number and diversity of devices and organizational networks is rapidly increasing. These new devices may expose organizations to new risk. That is absolutely without a doubt. It is undeniable, right? It's folklore, right? They say yes, IoT. It's a challenge, enterprise of things. But what we like to think is this report, and hopefully you'll get a sense that this report really tries to provide some substantiation behind that. So the goal of the Forescout Research Labs team is really to sort of foster innovation and collaboration in the areas of device visibility, right? That is a core capability that Forescout has provided for over 20 years, right? But also to add to that behavioral control and cybersecurity of any networked device, right? And truly any connected thing. So really sort of understanding the entirety of that. And the way that we've been able to achieve that at scale is leveraging our Forescout Device Cloud. So when we really look at it, inside of a cloud instance, we have 15 million devices, 15 million unique device fingerprints that are in there. Those devices represent, or each of those devices has greater than 100 different data points, different properties associated with them, right? That ultimately empowers a smart classification engine inside of our platform. All of the data is anonymized, right? It is an opt-in type of a thing, but ultimately that is a crowdsourced set of data that our customers put forth. We leverage it, we sanitize it, we aggregate it, amalgamate it, and then we make it available, both from an analysis perspective and reports such as what we're talking about, as well as inside of our platform. So really quickly, the data in a summary level, right? So the team analyzed data from 8 million of those devices at 506 different deployments using that device cloud, right? And it's interesting when we look at sort of the breakdown, it's basically an analysis. What we're going to really talk about is the analysis of the data in a variety of ways, right? First and foremost, from a geographic breakdown and an industry vertical breakdown. So of those devices, right, you can see in the Americas, the majority, 75% of government devices were in the Americas, 72% of financial services devices were in the Americas, right? You can kind of see the breakdown there. Whereas retail and manufacturing, there was a larger percentage in EMEA, right? Still paled in comparison to the Americas, with APJ sort of bringing up the rear. Ultimately, what we did throughout this analysis is really sort of compiled and leveraged a risk formula that was calculated as essentially as a function of a multitude of components of pieces, right? Vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that are detected, whether they were detected based on what we knew from third parties, from our integrations with vulnerability scanners, with third-party repositories, with the vendors themselves, right? Security events that have historically occurred associated with those devices, the services that those devices ultimately are part of, the services from a technology perspective that they comprise, that they communicate with, how they are connected, right? What connection mechanism do they rely upon? Is it secure? Those kinds of things, right? The vendor, obviously this can vary widely when we talk about, say, IP cameras or something like that, right? When we've got a multitude, we've got very lesser known, smaller vendors from the third world country, or you've got some that are more widely known, what have you. And then ultimately what the potential impact is of those devices and exactly sort of where they fit into the enterprise, right? What we found is we sort of broke out the devices into essentially three kind of main buckets, if you will. And what Forescout provides as a platform perspective is foundationally visibility across an enterprise. We do that really in each of the areas that are called out here. So IT, traditional information technology, traditional computing, networking, VoIP phones, mobile, those kinds of things, right? That very much fit into a traditional office or campus environment. The OT, operational technology space, fits a variety of categories as well, right? But there's a very different footprint, a very different set of devices that are connected in those operational technology environments. Energy and power, right? There's a multitude of programmable logic controllers and industrial control systems that comprise a power generation environment, a plant, if you will, or distribution of sending that power across those high voltage lines. Process manufacturing, the robotics involved with manufacturing, those kinds of things. Automation across multiple environments, logistics and supply chain, when we talk about shipping or things like what Amazon has in its fulfillment warehouses, right? All robotics, computerized. And then discrete manufacturing, right? So there's a multitude of different types of operational technology devices that fit in that bucket. And then IoT really tends to become a catch-all for the rest, right? Because if we think about, and this really is where we start to talk about the enterprise of things and the connected things of an enterprise. Printers, right? I look to my right, there's my connected printer. It's connected into my wireless network, and it's also connected out to the web services, IP cameras and smart buildings. Again, you know, I've got a Ring doorbell. I'm sure in your office environments, you've got IP cameras. There are building control systems from Honeywell and ABB and the like that ultimately control HVAC and security and those kinds of things. Healthcare, a multitude of healthcare. And if you followed the news of late, the Ryuk ransomware adversaries are very active going after healthcare providers, going after hospital systems and the like. Because ultimately, if we think about it, they have been taxed and burdened over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months. And the threat is only getting worse. It's getting exacerbated based on this pandemic. Banking and retail, you know, there are things that, you know, what's really interesting in trying to understand the threat vectors and really sort of what the different organizations have to deal with. Banking and retail have got a very very low threshold for disclosure. Banking has got regulars, they've got to answer to retail, PCI, those kinds of things. Ultimately, there's lots of devices that are comprised in there. There's money machines, ATMs, POS machines and the like, right? Multimedia and others. So really in these 3 different sort of larger buckets represent very distinct, but at the end of the day, they're very much interwoven in the various deployment environments. So let's talk about operating systems, right? At the lowest level, after you have the BIOS laid into a device, onto a device, there's an operating system. And that operating system is how it handles the communications and ultimately all of what happens on a device. What really sort of from a summary perspective, what jumps out right off the bat, Windows by far the most prevalent deployed. Second, by a much smaller margin over the others, really from a device footprint perspective, is Linux. Then we get into the Cisco iOS from a networking perspective, those kinds of things. And then even iOS, you know, in the government, for example, we look at iOS is a larger percentage of the devices than Cisco, right? So there's more iOS devices that are ultimately connected in there. And then it continues down. What's interesting, the second to last one down there, VxWorks, right? That's an embedded one. We ended up, there was a vulnerability that was a 0-day that was announced earlier this year, back I want to think it was like Q1 or so, regarding VxWorks from an embedded perspective. So lots of different risks associated with these. But some of the summaries, some of the summary findings. Traditional Windows, Linux certainly dominate, right? Roughly, you know, 20% or so, mobile, embedded, others, you know, but for the most part, Windows and Linux by far. Mobile is 10%, but that is really when we start to look at the BYOD devices, guest devices that are connecting to guest networks. Forescout's able to see them, to discover them, to gather some information from them and share that data up, right? So the iOS and the Android types of devices really comprise those BYOD and those guests, right? The embedded and the others, right? That sort of catch all down there in the last one, the VxWorks and the like, right? Very hard to manage and even really fully understand because they're sort of embedded. They're sort of in this black box of things. So at the end of the day, the risk associated with them sort of becomes I don't know, but we still need to be able to be aware of those devices and try to defend the enterprise from those devices and the risks that they pose, even though we're unable to necessarily quantify what that risk is. So when we look at the Windows, right, and Windows is one of those things that, you know, if you look at end of lifing of Windows, right, you would be surprised the number of occurrences, and maybe you wouldn't be because your own organization, but the number of organizations, the number of devices, the number of versions and instances of unsupported Windows, of Windows XP, of Windows 7, and that is even deployed out into a laptop-based form factor, right? Not even those that are in smart TVs and an embedded OS or in POS systems and those kinds of things, right? The challenge comes when we start to deal with those older legacy operating systems They're very hard to upgrade, right? The takeaway there is we've got legacy applications. We've got these environments and these systems that are reliant upon and haven't been ported over to newer code bases. So they're dealing with environments and need to be interacted with from Windows XP, from very old legacy operating systems. So the extended support from Microsoft becomes incredibly expensive for organizations. And at a time when you're trying to deal, when you can't deal with the support or the other aspects, in the middle of a pandemic, trying to now focus on how do we migrate these applications and upgrade the application so that we can get off of an unsupported or an incredibly expensive to support version of Windows, right? All of a sudden it becomes challenging. So risks from vulnerabilities. You know, there's a handful of vulnerabilities that are called out. You know, Bluekeep, Eternal Blue. You know, there are others, but Bluekeep's interesting, right? Bluekeep is one that it's an RDP vulnerability, right? And if you think about the convenience of what RDP provides from a usability perspective, it's great, right? Over the since the middle of March, more customers than I can count on one hand, I've been involved in trying to help them triage and respond to incidents associated with brute force attacks and or Bluekeep-ish types of risks, threats, and trying to identify, because if we think about it, right now all of a sudden, middle of March, user base is working from home. So they are communicating, they're VPNing in, they are doing something to communicate with their desktop system at work. Well, that's RDP. What system are you VPNing into the corporate network to access that RDP session? Is it a system that's been blessed? Is it something that is dealing with, that's patched, right? That is compliant, or are you leveraging your son or daughter's gaming system, right? So ultimately the challenges associated with Bluekeep ultimately is difficult, and the risks from these vulnerabilities continue to really to percolate up. It started back in January. I can remember when the 0-day was announced from, I think it was NSA, regarding the HTTPS vulnerability, right? So ultimately being able to understand the risk associated with these vulnerabilities across the enterprise. And these certainly are really a couple of the most popular ones, right? The most prevalent. Services that are existing in the environment. And when we look at really what those exist, SMB, Samba, right? The file sharing, those kinds of things. The combination of that and RDP really tend to be the first two, the primary ones that really drive a lot of the ransomware, the botnet, the advanced persistent threat events that occur, right? Those really represent the most common sets of threats. FTP to kind of a lesser extent, but that's more heavily leveraged, most heavily leveraged, as you can see there in the government space. Similarly with SSH. Telnet, the amount of Telnet that still exists as an unsecure protocol out there is quite frankly, that's really very surprising, right? So as it says, right, financial services leads in the Windows-related SMB and remote desktop, and then the government leads in the unencrypted, right, the unsecure FTP and Telnet. So this is interesting, right? A little matrix. When we look at the riskiest devices that exist in the enterprise by vertical and by type, right? So in the financial services, right, UPS systems fit into that operational technology space, and whether, you know, whatever they are, at the end of the day, their ability is to keep the lights on in the data center. That's the point of a UPS. Often they've got an underlying operating system. They've got these things, and at the end of the day, we need to be able to see them and understand the risk they pose and manage them as appropriate to the best extent possible. The challenge also presents itself when we deal with those UPS systems. They often have an outbound gateway to the vendor so that they can remote in, those kinds of things, right? Ultimately, that's another potential point of entry, another potential attack vector that needs to be watched and understood. In the government world, the top four are all around smart buildings, physical access control systems, HVACs, emergency communications, right? IP cameras, all of those really sort of represent the multitude. When we move to healthcare, it's a very different set. And if you think about what's involved in patient care, patient safety, and the like, pneumatic tube system, right? Air passageways, those kinds of things that ultimately needs to be there to supply oxygen and the like, to patients. Again, similarly, UPS, right? The need to be able to keep the lights on in a hospital setting. HL7 gateways, PACS archives, right? Very healthcare specific types of things that go into the healthcare that sort of represent the first set there. In the manufacturing side, a little bit of a hodgepodge, if you will, right? The new one in that is the programmable logic controller. So in a manufacturing sense, when we start to look at what comprises, if you will, the makeup of a manufacturing environment, you've got someone sitting at a terminal who's doing some control, right? And that is often a human management interface. They're interacting with it, and then there's something in between the human and the robots and the systems actually performing the work, that are manufacturing the device, that are packaging, that are doing whatever at the robotic side. There is this programmable logic controller, and it is configured to be able to do the various aspects and interact with both the machine part and the human, right? So it takes those and translates them in a way that ultimately can be interpreted. And then retail's kind of think about it, right? You walk into a mall, you walk into a store, you've got physical access systems, you've got HVAC systems that are controlling, that are connected to Honeywells and the like, right? You've got IP cameras throughout the environment that are being monitored, by security personnel. And then you've got the programmable logic controllers, again, that handle various aspects from a back office perspective. So this is an interesting one, and when we really start to look at the risks posed to organizations of these devices by type of device, physical access control systems and HVAC are 1 and 2. So physical access systems, again, is literally you go up to a building, you swipe your badge, and the doors open. That is the physical control, and that mechanism that's connected to the network because it's logging entry and exit and those kinds of things. And then HVAC, I mean, there was an occurrence, within the last handful of years where a major big box retail establishment was breached because of a connected unsecure HVAC system, right? And when you think about it, it's not just the fact that these systems themselves are connected. You've got personnel who are going to be logging in, who are going to be accessing them, and whether it is physically touching the network when they come to a location or it is a remote, at the end of the day, right, the threats posed are rather significant. So now what? I've been kind of rambling on here for about 30 minutes or so regarding the risks, right? But how do we handle these? The risks that pose. And I think first and foremost, the first thing that we want to do is ensure that we can have a complete discovery, continuously updated and up to date of all of the devices on our network, period. No matter what they are, no matter where they are at any given point in time, have a complete inventory. So how do we do that, right? We need to be able to integrate with the network. We need to be able to communicate with the network infrastructure and understand who's communicating to who and when and how and where, right? So that we have an awareness of HVAC systems and smart building control systems and IP cameras and printers and VoIP phones and all of that represents the entirety of the devices on there. And it's only at that point that we're able to understand what that device footprint looks like, can we then say, okay, now I need to start maybe enforcing some controls. I need to start enforcing some segmentation around the network so that we can isolate those devices that are connected, that are controlling my HVAC systems, or those devices that are controlling the building automation systems or the IP cameras or what have you, right? So that we can ultimately ensure that this device, right, this device only talks to this device, period, and that there is no cross-pollination or other types of things that could occur that ultimately expose the organization to unnecessary risks. Monitoring progressive patches released by vendors. And that is, patching hygiene is not just related to Microsoft, right? I'm not going to give Microsoft credit because they're not always the best about that. In Patch Tuesday, everybody loves Patch Tuesday, but at the end of the day, patches are released by every vendor, firmware updates, those kinds of things. That is something that we, as we look at the devices that are on our networks, again, I talked about it earlier. I've got Nests, I've got Google Homes, I've got Blinks, I've got Rings. I am on top of ensuring that they get updated and that their configuration is set such that those updates occur automatically. And I have to say that for the most part, they've come configured to automatically update, right? It's great. You hear the echoes, the echo dots, doo-doo, right, when they reboot after an update. But the onus of ensuring that these patches are deployed, are pulled down, are written to these devices, right, falls on you guys, falls on the teams. And then getting to a point where we can really detect exploitation attempts. So look for anomalous behavior. I've got an IP camera, make sure that that IP camera looks like an IP camera today and looks like an IP camera tomorrow. And not just looks, but behaves like an IP camera, right? An IP camera should not be trying to perform some call to some website or some IP address or what have you. That's ultimately when we start to think about, and you rewind the clock a bit, right, to the Mirai botnet that occurred a few years ago that took down the dying DNS servers out west, that took down a multitude of websites. That was because we as consumers deployed a boatload of IoT devices and DVRs and all of these types of things that had internet-facing exposed services that could have been and were ultimately exploited by the botnet. So understand really how these exploitation attempts can occur and really try to defend ourselves against them, right? So ultimately, Forescout can help with all of that. When we look at that little graphic, the graphic there, right, we talk about eyesight, and that is ensuring that we've got complete inventory of those devices that are occurring on my traditional IT, my IoT networks, right? I inspect very tightly coupled in there that is giving that complete situational awareness and visibility of the operational technology, the ICS, the SCADA networks, the PLCs, and those kinds of things, right? Being able to segment and monitor the communications and the traffic that's occurring across the network, leveraging iSegment. Let's say, I've got all of my buckets of devices by type. Now let's figure out who's talking to who so that I can start to baseline, and I can start to put some business rules around who should or shouldn't be allowed to communicate. And then fast forward a bit more, I need to restrict devices. I need to enforce controls and isolate devices that are either behaving badly, that are vulnerable, that expose a significant risk to the enterprise, right? So that I'm able to mitigate the risk in an automated, proactive fashion, right? So, across the board there, and as you see that cloud up top, that crowdsourced data, the device profile library, that cloud, device profile cloud, that is leveraged from a data provenance perspective. We're receiving that data, we're able to see that data, and then ultimately expose it, right? So how do we go about, we need to identify the devices, right? Ultimately ensure that we can see everything, classify them, right? We need to ensure that we can segment those devices by policy, by type, by group, right? And then automatically execute the policies across the enterprise for a multitude of vendors in a very heterogeneous footprint. So that is it for me. We've got a handful of attendees. Abdul is here to help monitor. If there are any Any questions, any thoughts, any concerns, any feedback on the session this morning?
Thank you, Scott. That was a wonderful talk. We have got so much information there. Any question, if you feel free to post it in the chat, then Scott will take from there. Any questions? No questions? Awesome. All right. So, Scott, I do have one question. As I'm in AppSec team, I mean, some organization use Qualys to scan the servers regularly. Do you think, apart from that, we need like many more different tools to find out those, like you have mentioned, SMB blue, like SMB ports or FTP ports, like those kind of ports?
So the challenge that vulnerability scanning tools in and of themselves present is that, I equate them to a sprinkler, right? To one of those rotary sprinklers. So if you can picture that, like you push it down on the ground and you turn it on and it goes and then back and it kind of does this spray, right? So point A, point a vulnerability scanning tool to your network, and you're going to point it to a subnet, and it's going to scan, and it's going to look for a heartbeat. If it gets a heartbeat, great. Then it's going to maybe do an Nmap scan or something to try and identify the device. What type of device is it? Are we going to do a credentialed scan or an uncredentialed scan, right? Those become point in time. Those become in a very large network, a very large enterprise network, the information that's provided in there. Is it better than nothing? Yes. Is that enough? No, because ultimately the moment that scan across an enterprise of 5, 10, 15, 50,000 devices starts, it's OBE, right? It is stale. Because that scan could have passed a subnet, and now that had 5 devices on it, or say it had 210 devices on it, and 100 of them left, and then 100 different ones came on, right?
Right.
That it's not enough by itself, right? So ultimately, what we talk to customers about when they say, "Well, we've got a vulnerability scanning tool," that's fantastic. Great. We integrate with vulnerability scanning tools. And what I would say is, Abdul, what I would propose is that we would ensure that every device that comes onto your network has been scanned, right? The challenge that those present by themselves, mind you, is that their transient devices that are not continuously on the network, are not scanned, right? Unless you're deploying an agent, you leverage an agent-based connection. But that somewhat defeats the purpose of having, an appliance-based scan to be performed. Yeah. You're starting to get agent bloat, right? So no, it's better than nothing from a visibility perspective. But again, then you end up in a situation where data can be stale, and how do you go about dealing with the ramifications of the credentials versus non-credentials, and what level of visibility do you really get inside of the device, and those kinds of things.
That's it.